Hello, I'm Ron Strickland. This particular video is one that I prepared for a presentation at a seminar organized by the Institute for Francophone Studies in Hanoi. And my title is When Challenges Become Opportunities, the Future of Online Humanities Courses. I begin with an epigram, a couple of paragraphs from Karl Marx's preface to A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy. There, Marx writes, at a certain stage of development, the material productive forces of society come into conflict with the existing relations of production. From forms of development of the productive forces, these relations turn into their fetters. Then begins an era of social revolution. In studying such transformations, it is always necessary to distinguish between the material transformation of the economic conditions of production, which can be determined with the precision of natural science, and the legal, political, religious, artistic, or philosophic, in short, the ideological forms in which men become conscious of this conflict and fight it out. Of course, Marx is referring to economic production and class struggle in this famous passage, but I've used it as an epigram because I'm struck by its relevance for the production of knowledge at our current moment in higher education. When online teaching burst onto the scene in the United States in the late 1990s, online teaching promised to increase class size, degrading the learning experience, and squeezing instructors into an assembly line work regime. But I took the opportunity at that time to experiment with an online graduate seminar with limited enrollment instead. That particular course was focused on Marxist cultural theory, using pedagogical structures and strategies founded on principles derived from my understanding of a Marxist concept of knowledge production. Here are the foundational assumptions. First, that knowledge production is a material process. Second, that knowledge is socially produced, not merely discovered. And third, that knowledge production is a site of mediation of political power. In what follows, I will elaborate these principles in the context of online teaching. First, knowledge production is a material process. Humanities courses in the American tradition are heavily dependent on oral communication, whether by formal lecture or by the more conversational mode of the seminar. Of course, oral communication is a material process, but it is relatively ephemeral. It lacks the substantial fixity of the written text. Furthermore, speech is imbued with associations of private individualism that obscure and work against the collective production of knowledge. By enhancing our capability for producing texts, disseminating texts, and storing text, digital technology and internet communication allow for materializing and deprivatizing a larger proportion of the classroom discourse. Professors can produce online lectures in advance. Students can produce responses to those lectures, responses to the focus texts, and essays in response to other students' essays. All of these texts can be posted online, and the material character of these artifacts allows for students to engage in the process of knowledge production in the relatively public sphere of the university class. In a limited sense, they are taking ideological positions and fighting it out, as Marx says. And in a manner of speaking, this is all possible because of a shift in the relations and conditions of production, whether material relations or in that relatively gray area where the material merges with the ideological. Perhaps you'll say I'm stretching this analogy too far. Nonetheless, my point is that introducing these elements disrupts the individualistic ethos of the traditional humanities pedagogy, which has two pernicious opposing effects. First, the formal lecture enforces a regimentation of learning. The individual who matters in this discourse is the professor, Students are always under considerable pressure to conform. This pressure is somewhat relaxed in the seminar model, but there the relaxation of formality, without a theorized framework for the production of knowledge, encourages a consumerist ethos, in which it is assumed that the student is like a consumer who can demand satisfaction from the professor and the institution. Both of these forms of individualism, these tendencies of the traditional model, impede the process of collective knowledge production. By the late 1990s, I had published several essays arguing that the University Humanities course should be a site for the active production of knowledge, rather than merely the transmission of established information. I was influenced by Antonio Gramsci's observation that each class group produces its own organic intellectuals, and by Paulo Freire's strategies for collective self-determination in knowledge production. I was also influenced by an essay from the psychoanalytic theorist Shoshana Fellman entitled Teaching Terminable and Interminable, which argued from a Lacanian perspective that conventional pedagogy is structured in such a way that the student is conditioned to mirror the teacher's knowledge, rather than attempting a breakthrough of understanding. Following Fellman, I rejected the traditional dichotomy of the knowing professor and the ignorant student. Students bring a wealth of knowledge into the classroom, and students' knowledge is not without power, supported as it is by regimes of truth informing family, community, and society. Such engagements between institutionally sanctioned and extra-institutional articulations of knowledge and power are aesthetic phenomena in the broad post-Kantian sense of the term. The politicization of aesthetics, it so happens, is a project undertaken by the French philosopher Jacques Rancière in a series of interviews published as a book in 1991. I was not familiar with Rancière's book at the time that I formulated my Marxist structures and strategies for humanities pedagogy and developed my first online courses. But when I later read the book and an earlier book by Rancière entitled The Ignorant Schoolmaster, I realized that we had come to many of the same conclusions. There he presents a theory of universal teaching for human emancipation, based on the experiments of the early 19th century French educator Joseph Jacotot. In revolutionary France, Jacotot established a reputation as a celebrated professor of humanities subjects, as well as mathematics. When in 1815, at the time of the Bourbon Restoration, he was forced into exile in Louvain, students there sought to study with him. But many of them knew no French, and Jacotot spoke no Flemish. As a preliminary gesture toward establishing a shared common language, Jacotot gave several students a recently published novel, Les Aventures de Télémaque, a novel about the experiences of Odysseus' son Telemachus from the Odyssey of Homer. The novel was published in French, but with Flemish translations on alternate facing pages. To Jacotot's surprise, at the end of a month, many of the students had learned French well enough without the intervention of a teacher, simply by reading the novel and following the Flemish translation on the facing pages. From this experience, Jacotot realized that traditional assumptions about the relationships among teachers, students, and objects of study were deeply flawed. The transmission model, which accords primary importance to the teacher, was highly overrated. In The Ignorant Schoolmaster, Rancière rejects the hierarchical structure of all magisterial pedagogies, which are premised on the assumption of inequality between the teacher and students. The hegemonic sensibility of inequality is inherent in the common practice of explication, in which the teacher explains to the student why the student's understanding is not quite acceptable just yet. The achievement of equality is delayed. There is always something left to master. And when the student finally becomes the professor, this structure of inequality is perpetuated with a new generation of students. The Jacotot model, by contrast, employs a heuristic principle of equality. What can be achieved, Rancière asks, if one begins not by emphasizing unequal levels of mastery, but by assuming that every human has an equal capacity for intelligence, an equal capacity to achieve understanding through a motivated engagement with the task of learning. Jacotot's method involves identifying a topic that students are eager to study, and then allowing the students to focus their attention on the object in stages by relating each element of it to other elements of knowledge that they already possess. This method runs counter to the tendency toward regimentation, characteristic of mass education. Regimentation may be, to some extent, unavoidable, but we should register our dissatisfaction, our nagging discomfort with regimented learning that simply reproduces established knowledge and suppresses the possibility for the production of new knowledge rather than the reproduction of existing information. Our constant projects of revising, refining, and reforming our syllabi and our curricula bear witness to the need to overcome the institutional barriers and obstacles that stand in the way of focused engagement on the part of teachers and students. Given the somewhat privileged conditions of an advanced graduate seminar with self-selected students and a topic not covered in the prescribed curriculum, my original course in Marxist cultural theory enjoyed some of the same advantages discovered by Jacotot and his students in Louvain. The online format enables a context in which the contributions of students as well as the teacher can be easily distributed. So the online format as well as the structure of the course accord with the egalitarian emphasis of Jacotot and Rancière. The online format makes it possible to de-emphasize the teacher's authority while elevating the importance of the object of study and the student's engagement with the texts. Textualizing or materializing and deprivatizing the process of knowledge production in this way counters the familiar structure of producer and consumer of knowledge, characteristic of conventional relationships between teachers and students. This is not the same thing as attempting to decenter the teacher's authority simply by declaring that the classroom is a democratic space for open debate. An instructor, after all, has the authority of the institution and the profession at one's back, whatever we might say about honoring students' voices. But the ease with which we can make material to textualize and deprivatize the production of knowledge with digital technology and internet communication has many good effects. Students have ample opportunity to absorb and reflect upon the professor's positions and arguments, possibly even to gain strengths in numbers in order to contest the professor's positions, perspectives, and interpretations. Students have time to consult other authorities outside the immediate classroom community, and a text-based online course can reinforce the recognition that knowledge is collectively produced and can be tested by critical interrogation. In some significant way, the material productive forces of higher education have been shifted by internet technology. It's a moment in which we can become conscious of the existing relations of production of knowledge that have turned into our fetters. And, as Marx would say, we can fight it out